Well, hello, North Park Church. Hello, everybody out there. Jason Wheeler here, one of the pastors at North Park Church in Columbus, Nebraska, coming to you with your life group application questions again for the week. And as always, continue to be very, very grateful that God has me doing that, and very, very grateful for all of you that are involved in the life groups out there. And for those of you that are not here in Columbus but still watching this stuff online, very grateful that you're deciding to kind of dig in to the week's message a little deeper with us. And we are in our Kingdom series still. I'm sure you guys are aware of that. This is week 132 of our Kingdom series, looking at the kingdom of heaven, working verse by verse straight through the Gospel of Matthew. And as I'm sure you guys remember, we're talking about disastrous decision making. And we're learning about that from Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12, where we hear of the death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod, the Tetrarch. So what we see here is Herod's guide to disastrous decisions. And last week, remember, we had part 1, and this week, of course, we're following up with part 2. So you guys get ready. Have your copy of God's Word open to Matthew 14, verses 1 through 12. I'm going to read those verses out loud right now. You guys follow along, and then we're going to jump into our discussion questions. Okay, here we go. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He's been raised from the dead. That is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. And because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people, because they held him to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guest, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Okay, so there are key verses, and remember, we're talking about, we've got four decision-making processes, 2 that we discussed last week and 2 that we have this week to go over, talking about Herod making decisions in light of. And last week we talked about personally generated beliefs, which is religion without any sort of doctrine. Remember that right thinking comes from right biblical doctrine. Biblically generated doctrine is the bedrock for good decision making. And what we see in Herod is that he jumped to these conclusions. For example, that John the Baptist performed miracles, that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead. Neither of those things were true, but this was a belief that Herod had generated, and he acted as though it were true. So the same principle needs to apply to us. We do not want to make decisions in light of personally generated beliefs. That is one step toward a disastrous decision. We want our decisions to be made on biblically generated doctrine. So we talked about that last week. And we also talked about making decisions on power-generated pride, which simply means doing something because you can. You have the ability to do that. We saw Herod do that, and we don't want to make the same mistake. Now, before we jump to brand new material, let's go ahead to question 1. So last week, I asked at the top of the lesson whether you ask yourself why you do what you do, why you think what you think. Do you consider your motivation? And that is a big idea that works its way all through this guide to disastrous decision making. This is something that we need to really get a grip on, considering why we do what we do. What are our decisions based on? What's our thinking based on? So, question 1, have you done anything with that over this last week? Have you done anything over the week to grow in your willingness to ask why you do what you do, why you think what you think, and then why or why not? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay. Hopefully, you have considered that over the week. I asked our homeschool co-op students that very question this morning, and there were a couple of them that I was very astounded and grateful to hear that they had put some serious consideration and thought into that question and had, in fact, grown in their willingness to consider their motives. So, you got some 12, 13-year-olds there that are putting some prayer and thought and effort into this. Hopefully you guys are as well. So moving on to question 2. Okay, so our new material this week, we learned that Herod made decisions based on pressure-generated actions. Remember that pressure that kept Herod from killing John the Baptist was the same pressure that caused him to kill him, right? The reason he didn't kill John the Baptist was because he was worried about what the Jews would do. And then the reason that ultimately he did kill John was because he was worried about what all of his friends and the people at his party would do or think. So, pressure-generated actions. That is a great way to make a disastrous decision. And the fourth thing that we talked about was passion-generated vows. That was the fourth step towards a disastrous decision that we discussed. So, back to pressure-generated actions. For question 2, how have you made pressure-generated actions recently? What does that even look like? Pressure from people. That could be a spouse, that could be kids, that could be a boss, that could be a coworker, that could be an employee, that could be pressure about what people might think in the line at the grocery store. You guys get it. Any sort of pressure, a pressure to keep a hold of some sort of idea of yourself or some idea that you think other people have about you. Either way, how have you made pressure-generated actions recently? And how are you about to do it again? And then what would you do differently if people weren't looking? Or what do you do differently when people aren't looking? Maybe you're the sort of person that comes to church and looks great while you're there because everybody's looking. You sound right, know the answers, and then leave the church and behave entirely differently because people aren't looking. Or maybe there's some really, really valuable sin that you would just love to hang on to and would just love to run right back to it. But you know that people are looking. So consider that. What would you do differently if people weren't looking? Or maybe what do you do differently when people aren't looking? Pray about that and consider those questions now. Okay, for question 3, you see three Bible verses there on your outline. Psalms 119, 113, Matthew 6:24, and 1 John 5:3. So first, somebody in your group, read those verses out loud, have them on hand to refer back to, pray about what God is telling us in those verses, and then answer this question. How do those verses relate to each other, and how do they relate to our decision-making process? And then how are they at life in your work, or at work in your life personally right now? Those verses certainly talk about loving God's law. They talk about the tendency or a warning against serving two masters. And then seeing God's commands as burdensome or not seeing them as burdensome. So how do those verses work together? How do they relate to our decision-making process? And then how are they at work in your life personally? Do you see evidence of those verses in your life? Are they encouraging to you? Are they a struggle for you? Pray about that and talk about that now. So moving on to question 4, remember that Herod made decisions in light of passion-generated vows, and we saw that with, the young girl dancing for him, and that there's a whole separate message that could probably be preached on that, but we certainly see passion-generated vows made there, right? I'll give you anything, he promises her. That comes back to bite him. So the question then for us, because we certainly don't want to make passion-generated vows. That is a step toward a disastrous decision. The question for us then is, what passion are you in danger of rushing into? How has that heart or that tendency, the passion-generated vow heart, how has that cost you in the past? And what do you suppose the consequences will be this time? Should you rush into whatever passion it is that is tempting to grab you and cause you to rush toward? And that could be any number of things. Of course, we see a lustful sort of passion in our story with Herod, don't we? But it could be any number of things. It could be corporate ladder climbing. It could be collection of money. It could be some sort of popularity or approval. It could be some sort of retribution. It could be love of a spouse, love of kids. You go on and on and on down the list, but some sort of passion. It's in the flesh, and you're in danger of rushing into it. How has that cost you in the past? And what do you suppose the consequences will be this time should you continue to chase it? Go ahead and pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, and for question 5, similar to 4, you might have discussed this some in your discussion of question 4, but possibly not. The question is simply this: is there a situation or area in your life that needs more self-control applied to it? Remember, self-control is one of the fruit of the Spirit, and that's going to go a long way towards keeping us from passion-generated vows, right? Kind of the flip side of that passion-flesh drive would be prayerful self-control. So is there a situation or area, maybe specific or maybe just in general, in your life that needs more self-control applied to it? Pray about that and talk about that now. Okay, and for question 6, takeaway, kind of a big one here, but so much value in these lessons here. Remember that Pastor Lynn, he made a statement on Sunday, and he said, you obey that which you love. So that's going to tell us a lot. Who or what do we really love? We're going to know based on who or what's calling the shots, who we're obeying. And we certainly need to be asking ourselves, who are we seeking to please in the moment? You know, as Pastor Lynn kind of talked about, everybody to some extent believes in God in a general sense, but to actually believe Him is a different thing. Believing in Him, you know, there's kind of almost a weird sort of cool, aloof pride that a person can have just by believing in God. But knowing solid biblical doctrine and believing what He says moment to moment, straight from that doctrine, well, that's a different sort of thing. So, the question is this, for question 6. How can these questions help you to consider who you are seeking to please, help you to consider who you are believing in the moment, and then help you to better make decisions in light of eternity? And then are there any specific next steps that come along with that? So hopefully these questions have helped you to kind of examine your ways and test them, see yourself in sober judgment, understand how your motivation compares in light of Scripture, and then who are you seeking to please? Yourself, some other person, or God? Who are you believing in moment to moment? Jesus or the flesh, fear, passion? And then how can you better make decisions in light of eternity and specific next steps? Well, that's it for this week, guys. As always, truly very grateful to have been here with you. Check out the website. It is really fantastic, and more content is being added all of the time. We're really, I believe, very quickly getting to a spot where that website can be just a one-stop for all of this content that we put out from the church, be it a Sunday message or Pastor Ryan's midweek message or this life group stuff, but also should hopefully have content or links very soon to all kinds of really helpful, healthy content from other people, solid Reformed people, so that I guess if you're going to jump online and you're going to get distracted by what's there, hopefully www.insidenp can be a spot where the distractions might be healthy. So check it out, www.insidenp.com, and if you need to get a hold of me or anybody else, you can certainly do that right there. And Lord willing, I will be back with you next week.